Hello, and welcome to today's screencast, Creating APIs with Grape within Rails. Today we'll be covering Grape, which is simply a small framework for creating APIs using Ruby that may or may not include Rails. In this example, we will use Rails, but it's not required. Also, this screencast only covers the very basics of Grape. So if you'd like to know more, please check out their website and their code on GitHub. So right now, to get started with the actual code, we'll create a new Rails project. We'll call it Converter because our API is going to be a simple conversion tool for currency. Now that it's done building, we'll simply go into that directory, open our editor, and we'll get started coding. All right, now that we're ready to start code, basic configuration before we can start writing Grape code. First off, we'll need to include the directories where Grape will live in both paths and auto load paths so that Rails knows where to load the constants. Now I just pasted this code in because it's a bit complicated to type while I'm talking about it, but the basics is just like I said. It will auto load our API. The next thing to do is to create a folder where this is going to live. So I'll create app API, and then we'll call this converter. And within our converter folder, we'll add a currency RB, which will be our class file. So now that that's set up, let's add Grape to our project. So to add Grape, it's quite simple. We will just open up our gem file and require the Grape gem. Next thing we'll do is actually install that. Now I've already installed it, so it installs very quickly. And then we'll actually create a blank API. So we'll simply create a Rails class and have it inherit from Grape API. Now this class will respond to API requests. But in order for it to respond to an API request, we need to tell it about resources and methods. So we have a resource called converter, a method, HTTP GET method called exchange, and we're going to echo the parameters. So any parameters we pass into the API will simply be echoed back for right now. Now, before we go further, we should take a minute and go over how Grape will generate the URL to access the API. Grape URLs are generated by a version, which we haven't added yet. It allows you to easily version your API. In a minute, you'll see we're going to add version v1 using the path. So it'll be part of the path. That'll be the first part of the path. A resource as converter, and then a method as exchange. So this all comes together as a URL v1/currency/exchange. Also, another way to inspect your URLs is to go into the console, and then in the API class itself. Now, another way to inspect the API and its URLs is within the console to load the class you created and then simply call routes on it. Because we only have one endpoint, we only have one route, but you can see where it has the URL here. So if you need to inspect the URLs, you can quickly find them here. Now, we'll start our server. And one last thing here is we will add in the version simply because it's a good form to have any API version. The server is started, we'll actually go look at this. Because this is a GET API, we can inspect it in the browser. So we localhost v1 converter exchange. I forgot one important step. We have to mount our API within the routes file so that Rails knows where to serve it. So we'll call this mount converter currency. We'll point that to /API so it doesn't mess up the rest of our application. And we'll add in API here, and bang, we have a response from our API. Now, as I said before, any parameter we put in here will be echoed back. However, it's right now responding in XML, and I'd prefer JSON. So to get a format JSON, refresh this page, and we now have the correct response in JSON. But this isn't doing much for us. So we'll now want to actually modify our code to make our API useful. In order to make our API useful, we'll want to do several things up front. First off, we'll create a helper to get our exchange rate. So we'll create a helpers block here, and then we'll just define a regular method in here. So get exchange rate, and we'll pass in a currency name. And here we'll just do a case statement, currency, and when it is new Taiwan dollars, we'll return 30. Else, we're going to raise an exception. Now, there's nothing interesting or new about this exception, except we'll just put a nice message on it. So, no conversion found for currency, and we'll output the currency here. Okay, so this helper method is now available for us to use here. But before we use it, we need to make sure that our API call has the correct parameters. So to do that, we can define this params block, and we can tell it which parameters are required and which ones are optional. Now for this example, I only have required parameters, but you could easily create an example or your own API that has optional parameters. So we'll have two parameters that we require. One is the amount, which is a float, and one is a to currency, which is going to be a type of string. Now, this does two important things for you. First, it requires the parameter, so if you don't pass it in, it will raise a nice error for you. And the second thing is it will actually do type conversion for you. So as an example of this, if I come back to our API and just refresh it, it says I'm missing a required parameter, to currency. So I'll add that in. So you'll see here, the amount is a floating point number, whereas the to currency is an actual string. The params has once declared with a type will do the conversion for you, which is extremely convenient. So now that the conversion is done properly, we can actually complete this endpoint by converting the currency. So we'll have a local variable here where we store the converted amount. We'll just do params amount, which is already converted to our floating point, multiplied by the exchange rate. Sorry, it's getting a little big here, so make that into 2 lines, and then we'll create a hash to actually return this value. So we'll have the amount again, which is going to be the converted amount, and then we'll have the currency, so we know which currency it was converted into. Just pass back the to currency here. And now when I refresh this, it's correct. I have the converted amount, and I have the currency it was converted into. So this is working, and it's working well. However, there are a couple more things we should look at before we wrap up. The most important one is error handling. As you'll remember from our code, if we pass in a currency that we don't know about, we're going to raise an error. So if I do that now, let's say I wanted to convert it into euros, I'm going to get a standard Rails error here, which I don't want. I would much prefer to have a nice API error. Well, Grape handles this as well. I can simply tell this to rescue from all, and then when I refresh this, I'm going to get a nice API error back. It will return this hash with a key of error and then the message. And this is the message that the error raised. So it's easy to get it into here. However, in a real API, you'd want something more than this. You'd probably want a status code and a success failure message. So to do this, also very easy in Grape, we just create an error formatter, and this is for the JSON format. We can have one for XML, and it can be different, or any other format you'd like. We create this lambda, and we get a lot of parameters here. So we get the message from the error, we get a backtrace, options, and the environment. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to use all of these. I'm simply going to give it a status of failure, or failed, it sounds better. We'll have the message, so we'll just return the message that it sent in, and I'm going to give it an error code. Now, in a real API, you'd probably want something a little more dynamic here, so you have a different error code for each error, but for example's sake, we'll just hard code something here. And that's it. I go back to my API and I call it, and you'll see immediately that the response is now formatted like I told it to. There's the status of failed, the message again, and then an error code. And that is the basics of creating an API with Grape. Obviously, there is much more to do here. They could make the error messages dynamic so that they're more accurate with a unique error code. We could improve the success response to include a status of successful. There are many small details that we haven't worked out yet. Additionally, you would probably want to move this into like an active record model to query the database to look up exchange rates. But this covers the basics of Grape and should get you started for creating your own APIs. So now that I'm wrapping up, just wanted to give you some more information. This is the URL you can find Grape at, and just a reminder that since we loaded it into Rails, you have access to all of Rails models, to everything that Rails gives you, all the helper methods. Now, even though it's loaded into Rails, Grape can be served alone. So if you do not need the Rails application, you can feel free to serve it by itself, since it is a standalone RAC application. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening.